the title is Why Do Some People Support Neo-Fascism? And as a peace education organization, we like to explain problems and solutions in an interesting manner. So the plan was for Shine Kapoor and Jasleen Kaur, two of our volunteers, to describe what exactly is meant by the insanity or absurdness of support for clearly irrational things that supremacist leaders ask people to do. Now, Jasleen suggested a very entertaining way to do it, a conversation. So, we have recorded two very frustrating conversations which explain the problem we are facing and the reason why we decided to have Dr. Shukla today to deliver this lecture. So, let's play the first one.
How can we be expected to survive? Everything is so expensive. Just the basic things we need are beyond reach. Food, gas cylinder, petrol, medicines. I hardly have any income. But my clothing business was destroyed because of demonetization. I cannot re-establish as I have no funds, and all these regulations discourage small businesses. When I go looking for a job, my business and my degree and my experience do not help, as there are no jobs in the market, and I do not know how will I survive.
तो रहने दे यार, तेरी तो हमेशा ही कंप्लेंट रहती है. You are talking as if everybody was a billionaire during Congress era.
No, they were not. My point here is that has the situation improved since Modi came to power, or has it become worse? And you don't have to be a Congress supporter to know that the situation is much, much worse now.
Hey, तू तो रहने दे. It is only because of Corona that this has happened. It is an act of God. What can Modi ji do in this?
But our economy was failing badly even before the pandemic.
Since Modi ji came, it was improving. But Modi ji can't change the whole mess created by Congress overnight, can he? Things were improving. You have to give a person time.
Arey yaar, I agree that things take time to change, but all the economic policies the Modi government has pursued since 2014 have been against the majority. They have only benefited the ultra rich. Look at demonetization. It completely destroyed me.
You only think of yourself. Modi ji thinks of the whole nation. What is the discomfort of one person when the whole nation was saved from the clutches of black money hoarders? Demonetization was a master stroke. Modi ji got all the black money back. Modi, 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 Modi.
Okay, acha, soon. Where is that black money? Nobody has seen the black money that was promised to be put back by doing demonetization. It only hurt common people. Big businesses gained because the cash economy was destroyed. It didn't bring back the black money.
It did. It did. It did.
Show me the proof. Only 1.04% of the money in circulation did not come back. So where is the black money?
तू तो रहने दे यार. Are you more intelligent than big economists who supported Modi ji in demonetization? I don't trust your figures. हर हर मोदी, घर घर मोदी, हर हर मोदी, घर घर मोदी.
Okay, all right. Those are government figures. Every year since 2014, GDP has been declining. And let me tell you, the numbers that we're talking about, I was just reading this article today only. And it says that in 2019, 4.18% was, the GDP was 4.18%, a 1.94% decline from 2018. In 2018, it says that in 2018, it was 6.12%, a 0.92% decline from 2017. And in 2017, it was 7.04%, a 1.21% decline. And it also mentions, the article also mentions that we had a negative GDP growth at 23.9% in the first quarter of 2020, and first contraction in more than 40 years.
Anyway, the thing is that we are world power now. We have everything. Bullet train, world-class malls, smart cities.
Where is all that? Where is all that?
On our WhatsApp group, Modi hai to mumkin hai. We see pics of India's great development every day. Man, we look like Switzerland. Modi, Modi, Modi,
All right.
Modi.
Okay. Wait. Switzerland is number 2 in Human Development Index. India is 131.
Keep your JNU figures to yourself. The world has accepted Modi ji as the best leader in the world. United Nations has declared it and called India a world power.
No, it hasn't. The Human Development Index is by the United Nations only. It is not created by JNU.
Oh, at least we are better than Pakistan.
Should we not compare ourselves with China or other countries that are better?
If we have so many problems with Modi ji, why don't you just go to Pakistan? Bharat Mata ki jai, Modi ji ki jai. You think Pappu can do it? Congress always has its agenda of defaming Modi ji. Pakistani dalal.
What's wrong with you? Why are you even talking about Congress or Pakistan? Modi had promised so many economic things that he has not delivered. Where is that 15 lakh he promised for everyone? Where are the jobs he promised? Where is that low price of petrol and cooking gas?
Well, I don't have to answer you. I'm only answerable to Modi ji, who depends on my loyalty. You are a part of that Tukde Tukde gang. It is people like you who are destroying India. Modi, 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 Modi.
So, as you can see, this was a very frustrating conversation for the poor woman on the left. No amount of logic or facts convinced the woman on the right. And in just a few minutes, you were able to see what it means to have a conversation with somebody who is a blind follower of a fascist leader. We're going to have a second conversation again by our volunteers, Shine and Jasleen. And Shine will be the Andhbhakt now, or a person who follows a fascist leader blindly. And Jasleen will be the person trying to make her see sense and logic. The reason we have changed the roles is because, as a peace education organization, we train to break stereotypes. Blind followers of fascism come in different styles. Here is the second conversation.
The government should tell people not to attend large gatherings, but instead, Modi is going around doing election rallies. And now Kumbh Mela is coming up. I can't believe that the government is allowing Kumbh Mela in these times. It is the worst thing one can do in COVID. Millions of people are gathering together.
Hey Bhagwan, what are you saying? Why should the Mela not happen? It has been happening for thousands of years. It is a part of our Hindu religion. And say Modi ji, not Modi. Modi ji respects our religion. Modi ji is the best. And there is nothing greater for him than the protection of Hinduism. He will never stop us from practicing our religion. Jai Shri Ram, Jai Shri Ram.
Arey bhai, I'm not discussing religion. I'm discussing corona and what can spread it.
Acha, is Corona bigger than God? Corona is nothing in front of God. God will protect us. Jai Shri Ram. You know, the only way to defeat Corona is to pray to the God. This is why Kumbh Mela is actually going to save us from Corona. Modi ji knows this, and that is why he is making us go to the Kumbh Mela, making sure that we go to the Kumbh Mela. Har Har Modi, Ghar Ghar Modi. Har Har Modi, Ghar Ghar Modi. Har Har Modi, Ghar Ghar Modi. Jai Shri
Are
Ram.
you serious? You realize that the Kumbh Mela means mega crowds? Millions of people without mask, social distancing, hygiene facilities? It is super spreader event.
No, it is not. It is a super godly event. गर्व से कहो हम हिंदू हैं. Super spreader event. Huh? Anything we do for God cannot be bad for us.
Then why were you upset with Muslims and Tablighi Jamaat?
I'm not talking about Muslims. I'm talking about the true God. I said God, Bhagwan, not Allah. Don't compare us to those Muslims. Their only goal in life is to destroy us Hindus.
Who told you that? But first, let us come back to why big gatherings must not be allowed.
No. Let's first discuss Muslims. You asked me how I know they want to destroy us. All you have to do is open your eyes. The proof is everywhere.
Where?
It's everywhere. I see so many messages on my WhatsApp groups.
You mean fake news?
No, I am an admin on a WhatsApp group, Bharat Mata Ki Jai, and we have over 1,000 members. We share PowerPoints every day. We are sent PowerPoints explaining all these Muslim tactics that will destroy Hindus.
Well, right now it seems that you want to destroy Hindus.
What do you mean?
Look, when you insist on going ahead with Kumbh Mela, you are putting at risk everyone who attends the Mela and the whole country. Everyone who attends the Kumbh Mela is Hindu, right? And the majority of the country is Hindu, right? So who will the Kumbh Mela hit the most?
Arey bhai, I told you, it can't hit us. I tell you, I'm stuck with idiots. Can't you understand? Kumbh Mela will ensure that we are protected. And should we stop praying to our gods and take this huge sin on our head because of these stupid Chinese? A true Hindu will never leave the holy bath during Kumbh Mela.
Look, my friend, God does not want us to do stupid things. You are calling other people stupid, but look at what you are doing. How can such a huge gathering with millions of people be the right thing to do in a pandemic?
Abey yaar, there is no pandemic. Modi ji has shown the world how to defeat the virus. He is the vaccine guru, as shown by Z News the other day. And there was, the Aaj Tak also said that he is India ke Papa. So Papa protects us. He's done what no other country could do. All international news platforms are saying Modi ji is great. By taking a dip in the holy water during Kumbh Mela, we'll make sure that the virus does not come back. Keep faith. Nothing bad will happen, okay? Modi ji is true Hindu. He has astha, faith. He knows what he is doing. You will not understand.
You are right. I won't understand because this is insanity.
So, oh, so the Hindu festival is insanity. Why don't you say something about Muslim festivals? They even eat meat.
I'm talking of all events, yeah, where a lot of people gather. Right now, we are talking of Kumbh Mela because that is what is coming up. I'm scared that it will lead to really bad spreading of COVID. It is not about Hinduism. It is about what should and should not be done. The government should take the right stand.
Why don't you talk about spreading of jihad, huh? The Modi government is the first government in the history of India that is trying to protect us Hindus. But you want to stop it? But we would let you because Modi ji is on our side. Modi hai to mumkin hai. You are a jihadi supporter. You are an urban Naxal. You are an anti-national, anti-Hindu, anti-Indian person.
Wow, thanks so much. That was an amazing performance by our friends and our volunteers, Shine and Jasleen. I'm not going to unmute everyone, but I'm sure we're all sort of applauding in our own rooms. I think that was great. Thanks again, Shine and Jasleen, and of course, thanks to our own Shireen who helped to organize and helped to write that script as well. With that, I would like to take this opportunity to welcome you to the second Peace Praxis lecture. So I'm Samir, also part of Peace Vigil. The Peace Praxis lecture series is a space to share knowledge from those who combine the theory and practice of peace education. Praxis is a word that has an ancient origin, but in modern times, we generally use it to denote a combination of theory and practice. It's especially used by those who promote social transformation. The idea is that it's not enough to be an expert who possesses knowledge, no matter how deep and valuable that knowledge might be. One must also put that knowledge into practice. For us at Peace Vigil, it isn't enough to partner with peace studies departments or other academic institutions. We must align and provide tools to those who fight prejudice and bigotry every day. This is the second Peace Praxis lecture. The first was with Ram Punyani, and that lecture in its entirety is available both on our website and on our YouTube channel. Today, we are honored to have with us Dr. Abhay Shukla, who has been working on the front lines as a medical doctor during these difficult times. I know he's been very busy with the COVID situation in Pune. He's also a theoretician, and we'll explore that more today. And therefore, he is someone who embodies what this lecture series is all about. Dr. Abhay Shukla is a public health physician with a postgraduate degree in community medicine from AIIMS, New Delhi. He's worked on health issues in collaboration with people's movements and grassroots NGOs in Maharashtra for 2 decades. Dr. Shukla is also Senior Program Coordinator with Sati Pune and is a member of advisory the National Human Rights Commission. He is a national convener of Jan Swasth Abhiyan, the People's Health Movement India, and has facilitated public hearings on the right to healthcare across the country. Dr. Shukla has authored and edited several books on health system issues. He's also contributed to developing the framework of community-based monitoring and planning of health services at the national level and in Maharashtra. He's involved in action and research for the promotion of patients' rights, the social regulation of the private medical sector, and universal healthcare. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Abhay Shukla.
So thanks a lot to the Peace Vigil group, and thanks Shireen and Samir and your entire team for organizing this talk. And the skit, both the skits were excellent. And I think they bring out very well the kind of problem that we face when we try to dialogue with many people who today seem to be very strongly attracted to what I will call neo-fascism and what you're all familiar with. And we need to understand that there is a rationality under this apparent irrational behavior. And if we understand that rationale, then maybe to some extent we can break that kind of deadlock which you saw in both those dialogues. Of course, it's not going to be easy, but it is possible, at least to a certain extent. So, since we're talking about the COVID situation, we know that across the world, there are different kinds of responses to the COVID situation. So I'll give you examples of two kinds of responses which we have seen in the past 1 year. Those of you who are from the US don't need to be told what that first cartoon is about. And those of you who are from India will easily identify with the second cartoon. And, so basically we have this, this is a pattern of certain kind of political leaders. So if you cannot control the problems which people are facing, then you just control the people instead of controlling the problem. And so then people will get so preoccupied, in just dealing with that they forget. I mean, of course, they cannot forget about the real problems, but they'll get diverted from that. So this is a brand of politics which we are seeing, which has arisen across the world, especially in the last 10, 15 years. In this regard, these are the kind of leaders about whom we can say this, that, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. So it's not actually just a laughing matter. It's not just people, who are somewhat misled. They're also, prone to support and sometimes even participate in committing the most inhuman kind of violence, which we have seen in India on multiple occasions. So we need to really understand what is going on here. And there are some paradoxes which we need to address. We have this understanding, that, with science and technology being developed, people will become more and more rational and scientific in their outlook. But the reality is that the current kind of growth that we are seeing, and it's, where new technologies are coming in every day, but along with the latest technologies, we have the most primitive and irrational ideologies. So something is wrong here, something different is happening. So we have this understanding that people, they usually behave logically and they should support those political forces which serve their own interests. But the actual situation is that large masses of people today, whether it is in India or United States or even in many other countries, including in Europe, significant sections of people are backing political forces which actually undermine their own material interests. So, and we generally have an understanding that, political battles, political contests should be based on logic, and any party which delivers better results should be supported by more people. But the reality is that appealing to people just based on their material interests may be necessary, but it's not sufficient. Mass emotions and psychology play a very important role in politics. And this kind of politics, which I will call neo-fascism, and many people are calling it neo-fascism, has greatly been strengthened since the global financial crisis, which of course, as you know, hit economies across the world. And after that, the kind of aggressively market-oriented pro-corporate economic policies have led to greater and greater inequalities in many countries. And in this situation, it's in this setting that these neo-fascist leaders come in. They, on one hand, they impose austerity, and on the other hand, they aggressively divide the population, whether it's on lines of religion or race or ethnicity or insiders and outsiders, natives versus immigrants or whatever. And these are some of the examples. You probably are familiar with all these gentlemen. And as you can see, they almost usually appear angry, and they very rarely laugh, and except maybe to ridicule their opponents. So this is actually also a big weakness of all these big leaders, and they really they can be significantly brought down a few notches just by ridicule, because they have no sense of humor in general. So anyway, how does this new fascism differ from the fascism of the first half of the 20th century, of which Hitler and Mussolini are the prime examples? Today, neo-fascism can come to power and remain to power even through elections. So it's authoritarianism which is actually reproduced through elections, because the electoral process itself is manipulated. Huge amount of money is used. It's fueled into the media, into various kinds of other processes, and therefore some sort of democracy remains, but it's completely hollowed. And there's a huge influence over the mass media and also the social media, and these kind of symbolic images which are repeatedly bombarded with. People are bombarded with these messages. These lead to a certain kind of a reshaping of people's psychology. And of course, there is state surveillance through very modern forms of technology, which were of course not available to Hitler or Mussolini, but today have become far more sophisticated. And also, usually this is combined with some kind of right-wing populism, some, real or promised or imagined benefits people think that they're going to get because of this leader. And in exchange for that, they give their support to the leader. So neo-fascism has a lot of similarities with fascism of the 20th century, but it also has these new features. And the crux is that we have on one hand, concentration of economic power through the aggressively pro-corporate policies, and accompanying that concentration of political and social power, which is neo-fascism. And these two very closely go together. Wherever you see neo-fascism, these are both combined with each other. So now let's go a little deeper into this entire phenomenon and understand how is neo-fascism actually, how is it formed, how is it and enforced on society. So it is a phenomenon which we cannot understand by only looking at one level. We have to look across multiple levels. At the economic level, recession, slowdown, stagnation in economies is a common feature. At the political level, there's a growth in repression. At the social level, restrictions and polarization in society is increased. At the cultural level, people are told to look back to their past, and there's a kind of reversion. And at the psychological level, there is a sort of regression, which I will describe. So recession, repression, restriction, reversion, and regression, these are all part of the neo-fascist formation, and these all reinforce each other. We cannot understand this phenomenon without looking at all the aspects. But my sort of understanding is that while other aspects have been well studied, the aspect of mass psychology has not been discussed enough, and we cannot understand neo-fascism without understanding the mass psychological component. And for this, we need to go into the human psyche. And of course, this is a social psyche. We're not just talking about a particular individual, but all human beings, all adult human beings at least, have these three components in their psyche. In the middle, you see reason, what is called the ego in Freudian language. It's called the adult in transactional analysis language, basically reason, which tries to figure out things, looking at facts, trying to analyze using some kind of logic, and it's linked with some sort of understanding of your material interests. The bottom figure is about the emotional component, which is very important in any human being's personality. And in this case, I have pointed out some of the negative emotions like insecurity, feeling of isolation, anger, hatred, which, and of course, there are many positive emotions also. But right now, I've just mentioned some of the negative emotions there. Very important. And the third is the taught or traditional part, which has been called the superego by Freud, or the parent in transactional analysis, which is basically culture. These are things which you should do. These are things which have been handed down from generation to generation. This is part of our culture, our religion, morality, rituals, symbols, and so on. So in any human being's psyche, all three of these are in some sort of a continuous interaction with each other. And a lot of the liberal, progressive sort of political processes, they try to appeal to the rational part of the personality. That, you know, this is how it is. These are the figures. These are the facts. As we saw in the skit, you know, these are the GDP growth rates. This is the Corona COVID situation. So it appeals to the rational part of the psyche. However, the other two parts, the taught part and the felt part, they have a different kind of dynamics. And the entire neo-fascist appeal is not primarily to reason. In fact, it bypasses reason. It avoids rational arguments, and it taps into two other very powerful parts of the human psyche, which is the emotional part and the taught part of tradition. So it becomes effectively like the reason part, rational part, which is guided by the conscious mind, and that leads to kind of appeals to a politics of the conscious. But the other two parts together, which are appealed to by the neo-fascists, is a politics which is to a large extent guided by the subconscious, because people do not even realize why they are responding in a particular way, but they are very strongly moved in certain ways. And we have to understand this, that it's often a subconscious or only partly conscious way in which the neo-fascist appeal operates. So now you all are probably familiar with the analogy of the rider and the elephant. So in the human mind, the rider is the logical part of the brain, and the elephant is the emotional part of the brain. So the rider, the rational part of the brain is reflective. It looks at facts, it looks at figures, it looks at, tries to do some sort of analysis and takes some time to reach a decision. The subconscious part of the brain is reflexive. It reacts immediately. It does not reflect. And it is actually, in many ways, that's why it's called the elephant. It's has a much more powerful influence on the brain. And actually what we are seeing today is that the direction in which the subconscious processes are being pulled may be quite opposite to where actually the logical part of the brain may induce a person to think towards. So that is why the neo-fascist appeal can pull people in a direction which is quite contrary to actually ordinary logic. And we need to understand this. So effectively, we are talking about two different modes of politics. In progressive liberal politics, facts are central. In neo-fascist politics, facts are actually secondary. The narrative that, and which you saw in the skit, that, you know, this leader, he's a great leader and we just believe in him and he's saving the country and he's defeating the enemies of the country. That's it. This is a narrative. Now you don't have to, the facts become secondary. Instead of looking at the socio-economic structure, it's appealing to culture and religion. Instead of demands, you have a focus on identity and so on, symbols, a glorification of the past, and an appeal to emotions and tradition rather than reason. These all are characteristics of the neo-fascist politics. So we have to go deep into this to understand what is going on in the mind of any person who supports neo-fascism. Now here I'll just mention one phenomenon which was very striking in the Indian context. And you might have heard about this or read about it, and that was lynchings of people across India, especially in 2017 and 18. And at that time, I had written an article called Pathological Normalcy. Now, this term itself may sound a little contradictory, but actually, if you see it, you know, what happened in that period was that hundreds and perhaps thousands of ordinary people were, for some period of time, they were induced to behave in a very irrational way. And they got together and killed their own neighbors or some local, maybe some, even if they were not neighbors, some ordinary people just on the basis of a whipped up suspicion, which was, and that those suspicions and those violent reactions they're bred on the basis of a deeper medium of hatred which had been cultivated through social media and the mass media. And we cannot understand those violent incidents in isolation. These aberrant incidents are squarely located in the mainstream. And neo-fascism is exactly about this. It's about reshaping what we call normal consciousness into pathological attitudes. And those start becoming the new normal. Hatred, irrational, exaggerated, unfounded hatred, and a feeling of threat has no or very little rational basis starts becoming the new normal. And actually, that is the whole job of the neo-fascist media and social media, to create this pathological normalcy. And now we need to understand that how it is actually economic and economic and political processes which create the ground for the psychology of neo-fascism. This psychology does not arise in a vacuum. It's not something that just drops from the sky. There's a very real material basis in which this is created. And if you see in the last, especially couple of decades, with more and more precarious livelihoods, high levels of unemployment, I'm talking about India particularly, but maybe applicable even to many other countries, there's a growing insecurity and fear, and also a fear of failure because you don't know whether your livelihood is going to continue. There's a diffuse anger because there is suffering. There is a feeling of inequality. There's a feeling that, people are not getting what they should, but there's no target for this anger. So it becomes a kind of diffuse anger and rage, which is waiting to be tapped. There's a weakening of collective systems, communities, public institutions, schools, public hospitals, and therefore the natural kind of material collectivity starts getting weakened. And at the same time, there's a yearning for some sort of anchoring, because human beings are deeply social beings and they need collectivities, they need some kind of anchoring. And therefore, with this kind of social fragmentation and atomization, there is a powerful desire for some kind of stability and collective identity. So the existing bases of collectivity are weakened, and public institutions are crumbling. Social collectives are getting fragmented. There's raised insecurity, kind of diffuse rage and anger, and all of these create the ground then for a deep and constant anxiety and sense of isolation, a desire for stability, into which the neo-fascist formation enters. And they give a repackaged sense of collectivity. Garv se kaho hum Hindu hain. Make America great again, and whatever else. So they give a different kind of repackaged sense. It's actually very superficial and illusory, but it gives a repackaged sense of collectivity, an illusion of upward mobility and progress, which actually is very, very superficial and usually non-existent. And identification with the Superman who's going to solve all the problems, because we ourselves have been reduced to a state of importance. So we then start identifying with the Superman. And the rage, that diffuse anger, is now directed against some other target, a religious minority, a racial minority, immigrants, ethnic minorities, whoever those may be. They are made the kind of scapegoat for this rage. So these are the deep psychological processes which are materially embedded. They are not arising in a vacuum. They are created by the political economy of the current emerging situation, and they are utilized, or I would say misutilized and manipulated, to create the mass psychology of neo-fascism. And there are existing social frameworks also of conformity, because neo-fascism is very closely linked with conformity. So patriarchal family structures which have existed for generations and centuries, caste hierarchies or racial hierarchies in many, many societies, religious traditions and prejudices, disciplinarian schools, a culture of sexual repression and rigid norms, all of these exist in many societies, probably in most societies in some form. So these hierarchies are, all of them give a common message that, there is within society some people are better than others, some people are superior, some people are inferior, or certain groups are superior or inferior. There's a relationship of power, a hierarchy of power, and we should obey the powerful and have a contempt for those who are inferior. And neo-fascism builds on this. Neo-fascism converts this into a political ideology using these frameworks and then building upon them. So now let us see, there are certain people who long back actually understood what was going on at the psychological level with fascism. At that time, it was fascism. So in the 1940s and 50s, which is almost, 70, 80 years back, more than 80 years back, somebody called Theodor Adorno, he was working in the US. He was from Germany, but later on migrated to the US. And he said that fascism is a sophisticated form of mass suggestion, almost like a hypnotic spell. And you know what happens in hypnosis, that a person can be made to believe things which do not exist or which are actually not there in reality. So it's a very high degree of mass suggestibility. And the human psyche is a very fascinating and also in some ways complex entity. And therefore he then looked at more at a deeper level at what are the psychological needs and processes and structures which are very real as economic structures or economic needs. And these, which he discussed more than 70, 80 years back, still remain relevant today. So he talked about the authoritarian personality. So the authoritarian personality, that's typical person who subscribes to fascism or neo-fascism, what do they gain? If they do not gain in any material sense, they gain a group identity. And the importance of this cannot be underestimated. And this can be broken only by powerful counter progressive or positive identity. So you cannot take away a person's identity just by arguments. It requires something more than that. And the followers, actually the bonds among the followers are not very strong, but they are two core aspects of this bonding. One is whom they hate and the other is whom they admire. And that's more or less it. Everything else is superficial. So everything is bound around these two goals. You have to hate somebody and you have to admire the top leader. And then there's this identification with the supreme leader. And if you criticize the leader, even on the basis of sound logic, it results in a backlash from this follower because it seems to them like this is an attack on their own identity. And somebody called Altemeyer, a psychologist in the US, working in Canada and the US, he did extensive research in the 1970s, 80s, and he showed even in North America, and probably also true for Europe, that there are two main categories of subtypes of people who support neo-fascist leaders. The first category is authoritarian followers who are used to submission, who usually always like to follow the rules, whether they're right or wrong, very self-group centric. They bind within their own group, but dislike people from other groups, tend to be dogmatic, and get a lot of satisfaction from being part of a big crowd or collective just by being there, not by doing something, or not by participating in something, but just by being part of a larger group. And they have very often limited sources of information, as you know, maybe just the WhatsApp university, and very compartmentalized minds. This is an interesting point which we'll come back to. So these are the authoritarian followers, their kind of psychic makeup. The other major category is social dominators. And these are maybe smaller in number, but these are people who have been brought up or who have been, whose personality has developed in a way that they like to dominate others in their social group, in their family group. They enjoy exercising power, and they may often be have some kind of privilege, either on the basis of class or race or caste or gender. Most of them are likely to be men from the dominant ethnic or caste or racial, kind of stratum of society, usually opposed to equality, and admire and also like to impose hierarchy. And they can be very aggressive. They can be quite bullying, and they identify with the supreme leader because he's the big bully, and they like to be powerful like him. It's always him. And there's another paradox that the neo-fascist followers who often come from relatively privileged sections of society, they simultaneously feel themselves to become powerful by joining the neo-fascist formation, and also they view themselves as victims. So they feel that, paradoxically, that they are themselves they're under threat in some way. So these minorities, these people from the religious minority, these immigrants, these Muslims, they are going to threaten us. And even though we are actually much more powerful and dominant, and therefore the neo-fascist leader is going to save us. And he will make society to return to order, the patriarchal caste and racial hierarchy. And at the same time, he offers a feeling of belonging to an imagined collective. And of course, there's often an attraction to grandiosity. There are some symbolic, grandiose things that the leader does. So I'm going to build a wall, or I'm going to build a huge statue, or something like that, which often even that may not actually ever happen, but it's just like, or a Ram temple. And that itself becomes the basis for people to have this feeling of, so they feel a paradoxical oscillation between feeling of being a victim and being omnipotent. This is typical of the neo-fascist personality. And the entire group identifies with the leader. One important point is the core basis of neo-fascism is extreme and forced dichotomy between those who are within the group and those who are outside the group. There is no gray. It's only black and white. And this requires a hammering of false and forced polarizations. And there is a perpetual performance by the leader. The leader will always be in the news. And every few days or every couple of weeks, he will be doing something, which fascinates the masses in some form. And at the same time, the fascist organization keeps fueling this hatred for the other. In this way, basically, because neo-fascism cannot retain support of large masses of people through rational arguments. Please note this fact. It's impossible for them because they do not have rational arguments. So therefore, they have to maintain this spell. It's like a collective hypnotic spell, which continually mobilizes irrational and subconscious processes, often through these spectacular events and actions. So, this huge, sometimes Modi ji will invite Donald Trump and they'll have a huge, rally. Sometimes it will be something else. And so there's a continuous performance. And therefore, the authoritarian leader is basically a performer in the theatrical sense. And this authoritarian leader has a peculiar quality of being simultaneously a superman and also claiming to be from an average background. So people can identify with him because he's somebody like us, but he's also a superman, and therefore I can admire him. This is typical of the authoritarian neo-fascist leader. And the neo-fascist leader allows each follower to satisfy a twofold wish. On one hand, they submit to authority, and the other hand, because they are a follower of the top leader, they feel like an authority themselves. So this sense of identification also gives them a false sense of power or a spurious sense of power. And the leader may have very little other qualities. The leader may know nothing about economics or politics or society in general or any other technical aspect, but he has two qualities. He knows the psychological needs of followers, not necessarily their other needs, but their psychological needs. That these are people who require a sense of identity. They are inhibited, and he speaks without inhibition and also in some way convincingly what is there in the subconscious among his followers. So his followers, they outsource their subconscious to the leader. And this is the typical quality of continuous oral communication. The neo-fascist leader is always a great talker and probably nothing else but a great talker. And that is how he maintains this, hypnotic spell and rationally uses mass irrationality. And this leads to bubble thinking, and which actually the skits, they showed it very well. There's something called delusion. Delusion is a psychological term. A delusion is a belief in a belief which is not actually linked with reality. So neo-fascism has to be built on the basis of collective delusions. And people start believing certain things not because they are true, because one wants to believe it is so. And this is why I call it a form of psychological regression, because small children do this. They think that if I want something and I want it sufficiently, I'll get it. It doesn't. The world doesn't work that way. We know that. But these delusions, these delusional beliefs, are woven together and make an integrated narrative, which is actually based on a certain kind of falsehood or detachment from reality. Let us say. I mean, of course, there is some linkage with reality, but it's completely exaggerated, distorted, and and that leads to this bubble thinking. Now, these followers may be people who are scientists, engineers, IT professionals, doctors, whatever, highly educated. They may have excellent technical capacities, but their rationality is bounded, it's limited, it's circumscribed. And with the same technical skills, they also may have mind-boggling, what I call irrationalization. When you rationalize something which is totally irrational, I call it irrationalization at the social and political level. So the mind is divided. It's a divided mind. It's a compartmentalized mind of which one part is functioning rationally and the other part is hijacked by the neo-fascist emotion and tradition-linked entire formation. And the core identity of the blind followers is tied up with these beliefs. So a single fact or a single piece of logic is not sufficient. In fact, it threatens the follower if you try to argue with them logically. So it's actually a very difficult situation, as we saw in the skit. It's probably not possible easily to just have a logical argument with such a follower. There's something different which has to be done and which we will discuss. So this is called contamination of rationality. The reason has been eclipsed from two sides. Instead of a person thinking independently and assessing facts in a balanced and objective way, his or her reason has been overshadowed on one hand by certain emotions, insecurity, isolation, anger, hatred, which overshadow the reason. And on the other hand, certain interpretation of culture and religion. It's a certain interpretation, and which causes prejudice that, Muslims are like this, immigrants are like that, blacks are like this, whatever, and delusional thinking. So this eclipse of reason, this overshadowing of reason by these two other components of the personality lead to prejudice on one hand and delusional thinking on the other hand. And these together pull the entire personality in a direction which is quite irrational. Now, reality, as we know, is very complex. And there are so many dimensions. There's such a huge spectrum in any society, in any community, in any country. There are so many different kinds of social, cultural, religious. There's so much diversity which must be recognized and must be, in fact, celebrated and must be, understood and comprehended. So that is reality. What is the neo-fascist view of reality? The neo-fascist view of reality is very simple. There are just two colors, black and white. And this is the false polarization, and I would rather should say the false binary, which is imposed by the neo-fascist vision on society. Now, this is linked to something which probably goes long back in human history, probably to prehistoric times. And we see this in other primates, that there is something which is called in-group help, out-group hatred. So we see this in monkeys and other primates, and this was there in prehistoric human beings, that cooperativeness among members of the same group combined with aggression towards people outside the group, members outside the group. So, and someone has called this parochial altruism, which means that you're very good, well-natured, cooperative to people whom you consider to be part of your own group. You may even be quite religious and moralistic. But as soon as it comes to outsiders who are outside your group, your whole concept of morality changes. And there you can become much more, completely violent or, dismissive or discriminatory. So I would like to re-emphasize this point because it's a very important point. Human beings, these are two models about human beings which are sort of commonly held. One is that basically every person is individualistic, human beings are selfish, and there's no society, only individuals. Is a typical capitalist kind of viewpoint, which is one viewpoint. And usually counterposed to that is the liberal framework that humanity is one, we are all part of the same globe and the same world, and so on. Now, of course, both of these have some validity, but actually the reality, as far as most research shows, is that human beings are groupish. They are neither purely individualistic and nor purely altruistic. They have a groupish kind of behavior which has diverse potentials. And human beings usually have a tendency to be collective within small groups, in their own community, in their own workplace, in their own social and cultural groups where they are comfortable. And these small groups have both potentials. They can either lead to hostility towards other groups, as you can see during a soccer match or a cricket match, especially when it is being played between two different countries, teams from two different countries. So there's a hostility toward the other group, or it can lead to wider solidarity, which needs to be cultivated and developed. So this groupish behavior of human beings is powerfully manipulated by neo-fascists. And this is the basis for their posing of us versus them. So it has some resonance, and we have to reckon with this, and we have to recognize this. So now I'll just summarize this part of the argument, what I have called 12 easy steps to construct and maintain neo-fascist dominance. So stoke popular fear and suspicion against some minority group, build upon diffuse anger, tell people that they have themselves been victimized, that they themselves have suffered injustice, even if they are actually, there is no such thing. Then the majority is made to be felt like a minority. And, harness this insecurity, pretend to offer security, and building on all of this, attract followers to their imagined collective majority. Hum Hindu hai, we are whites and we'll make America great again, or whatever it may be. And make this identity is critical. And everybody is made their other identities. Every human being has so many different identities. The same person is a worker, a male, an Indian, upper caste or lower caste person, etc., etc., a professional. So all other identities become submerged, and only one identity, which is that primary, political identity, which is whether it is religious or racial or whatever, is made the primary identity. And the strong leader is a representative of that identity, and that resonates with people. And then the hard binary between us and them, those who are part of our group and those who are not part of our group. The whole world is just divided into two groups. And the same messages are relentless. Goebbels, had of course said this, that it repeat the same line 100 times and it is treated like the truth. And that is going on today. And then there's this perpetual performance, and there's always some illusion of novelty. So, some spectacular event or some controversial statement or something or the other is going on. And this kind of echo chamber thinking, which is resistant to external logic. And, this finally allows the followers to, actively support and even engage in violence against the others. And the leader manipulates this on a continued basis. So this continued psychological manipulation, performance, and mass suggestion or hypnotic suggestion is what is the core of neo-fascist dominance. Okay, so I'll now come to the second part of my slides, actually, which talks about what needs to be done in this situation. So basically, neo-fascism politically uses religion. And practically every neo-fascist uses religion. Because religion, as we know, is a very complex social, cultural, historical kind of complex entity which exists in any society. And the neo-fascists make a very, very utilitarian and I would say manipulative use of religion. So they pick up some religious symbols, traditions, maybe some rituals, and a very extroverted and superficial form of religiosity. It's not even religion. So as we said there, Kumbh Mela, I mean, so some particular ritual or some particular activity is kind of highlighted, and the religion becomes a source of group identity and bonding rather than personal reflection or humanist caring for other people or some kind of deeper spirituality, which are also aspects of religion, which obviously have attracted human beings since the beginning of time. But rather than actually going into those aspects of religion, the neo-fascists make a very, very crude use of religion to make the group, their followers, the group of their followers, to bind them together. And that's why I've said that when it is used politically, religion becomes binding yet blinding. Binding yet blinding. Because people are made to believe that we are all part of the same religion. So we have a common set of interests, which may be actually non-existent, but whatever. And we are blind to people who are outside our religion. And religion becomes a tool for neo-fascist leaders to divide society into us and them. And like Sam Harris has said that, I'm sorry, the quote, the name is small, but you might have heard about Sam Harris. He says that one of the problems with religion is that it creates in-group loyalty and out-group hostility. This is critical, in-group loyalty and out-group hostility, even when members of our own group are behaving like psychopaths. So this is how religion is used by the neo-fascists. So now I come to the second and last part. How can we make use of this understanding of psychology? So maybe you might agree with some of the things that I have said, but your logical question will be that, okay, maybe Dr. Shukla, what you're saying is, okay, but how does this help us? And I will first of all say very frankly that this is an emerging area of discourse. It's a highly interdisciplinary area, as you must have realized. There are very few people who are experts in the mass psychology of neo-fascism because, except those who are practicing it as neo-fascist leaders, probably. So it's not an area, it requires an understanding of economy, of society, of culture, of politics, and of psychology, all of these. So it's something which is still in an emergent stage, I would say, but it's very important. And we can use this not as some sort of a magic tool or a, some sort of a panacea, but yes, definitely it can help us. It gives us many clues about how to penetrate that bubble and how to challenge this neo-fascist entire formation. So first of all, we have to understand the personal is political. This is a slogan which the feminist movement has given since a long time. And once again, neo-fascism has brought us back to us, that slogan. The personal is political. The personal psychology of each and every neo-fascist follower becomes the basis of neo-fascist politics. And the need for identity is a very strong and basic human need. This cannot be dismissed or subsumed only by dealing with material needs. And you can see this is happening all the time. You see that between two different political formations, one is only hammering identity, and the other is talking about all kinds of things: healthcare, education, employment, poverty, and housing, XYZ. And you see that the party which is talking about identity is winning in many situations. Fortunately, not in all situations. And last year's US election has shown us that, human beings have both potentials. But we have to address the need for identity. And if it is not done in a progressive direction, it will be done in a deeply regressive direction. Psychological structures are real and they have to be understood and transformed. And negative emotions cannot be countered by logic alone. This is one of the core messages of my talk. If somebody is emotionally swayed in a very negative way by hatred, by insecurity, by some kind of negative emotions, and you try to argue with him or her just rationally, it's actually not going to work very well. So what we need are rationally embedded positive emotions. And negative emotions can be replaced by positive emotions, not just by logic. Now, this is something which can be unpacked, and maybe in the discussion we can unpack it, but I think this is critical to our entire understanding of how to deal with people who are attracted to neo-fascism. And I come back to that diagram again, which we had, but this time, if you see in the emotional category, we're talking about positive emotions. Empathy, solidarity, passion to resist injustice, a drive for collectivity, of genuine collectivity. These are all very strong human emotions. And these can become the basis for a different kind of imagination, a different kind of way. The reason has to expand rather than being eclipsed. It has to expand to embrace emotional. Reason is not isolated from emotion. And if it is so, then it's going to fail or it's going to be very limited in its effectiveness. It has to embrace the emotional. It has to actually have a sort of an alliance with the emotional part of the human psyche if it is to be effective. And I'd like to just tell you here that there are many studies, and there's an excellent book called Descartes' Error, which shows that all important decisions which human beings take are not taken just on the basis of reason. It's a complex interplay between reason and emotion which operates. So the reason has to embrace emotion, and it also has to re-engage with tradition. And in our own culture, in every culture of the world, there are egalitarian traditions, there are transformative traditions, there are powerful, positive historical symbols whom we have to relate to. Otherwise, our reason becomes sterile. It doesn't appeal to people. It doesn't really move people, even though it might have a rational basis. So reason has to re-engage with both positive emotions and with progressive traditions for it to be able to counter the neo-fascist combination. And particularly this fusion between. So when I was listening to the song at the beginning of the program, that is what I felt, that was such a beautiful expression of this. So there's so many ways in which this can be re-strengthened and rebuilt. And the other very important point is that neo-fascism, for it to be disintegrated, democracy is absolutely fatal for neo-fascism. But this democracy cannot just remain an empty signifier. We have to fill this democracy with content. People have to relate to it at a rational and emotional level. Democracy is not just voting once in 5 years. It's about empathy, social connection, equity, solidarity, justice, a challenge to domination, appreciation of diversity. These are all parts of democracy. We have to unpack democracy and make it real, something which people can relate with. Then they will stand up for it, and then they will fight for it. And we know that when human beings are really inspired by democracy, they can stand up against any kind of oppression. And therefore, in this entire context, we need an expanded vision of democracy, which has a positive, both rational and emotional content, and which is of course also linked with, as we saw in the earlier slides, that it is today huge inequities, unemployment, various kinds of material deprivation, erosion of collectives of various kinds, which has led to the emergence of neo-fascism. So our version of democracy cannot just be a legalistic version. It cannot just be saying, this is written in the constitution, full stop. It has to link with people, what people are struggling for on the ground, their livelihoods, their social rights, healthcare, education, employment, housing, etc., etc. In the Indian situation, agriculture. You know what is happening today in India in terms of the farmers' movement. So these are all important parts of democracy. But the challenge to neo-fascism has to come from a comprehensive democracy, which is economic democracy, political democracy, social democracy, cultural democracy, not just a limited political democracy. So I think this is important, that we have to expand and make much more effective and engaging our understanding and our appeal of democracy. Now, this is something which I'm not going to go into detail, but I have categorized the supporters of neo-fascism into 5 categories. The first category is the orchestrators, the main leaders, including the corporate supporters. So they directly gain from neo-fascism, and you cannot convert them. Just forget about that. The second are the economic beneficiaries of pro-corporate policies, top people in the business class, even the upper middle class, who has achieved upward mobility in the neoliberal framework. So they are also, comfortable. And third are the hardcore devotees, who are often social dominators, who have a strong psychological and cultural gain, and they gain cultural power. Let us understand, it's not just political power, it's cultural power, social power. And these first 3 categories are fortunately only a minority. The Fourth and fifth categories are what I call admirers, who have some sort of illusions and they get some psychological gain by associating themselves with neo-fascism. And what I call the odd followers, who are actually, partly scared if they, resist this powerful entity, and partly maybe they think they'll get some material favors from populist policies. Fortunately, A, B, and C, whom I call the active supporters, are a relatively small section. And what I'm calling the passive followers are much more numerous, who are under influence of neo-fascism today, but they can be detached from neo-fascist influence tomorrow if we have appropriate approaches to do that. And of course, this requires more discussion and we can discuss this. But we have to be very, very clear that we should not get into false binary arguments. So do you support Modi or Rahul? This is a false binary. And if we get into this kind of argument, we'll never be able to move forward. Are you pro-Hindu or anti-Hindu? This is a false binary. And these kind of false binaries are continuously posed in the neo-fascist discourse. And we have to have a different understanding of how to promote a diversity, even in our modes of argument. And in our communication, as I have said, there are three parts. There's a text, there's a subtext, and there's a context. So the text is the rational part. The subtext is the emotional part. And the context is the socio-cultural anchoring of the argument. So in our arguments, we need to be conscious of all three. And neo-fascist leaders do all three. Actually, their text itself is very minimal. Make America great again. Now, what does this mean? It's almost an empty slogan. But there's a powerful subtext. And there's a powerful social cultural context, which gives that apparently silly slogan so much appeal to some large sections of people. So we have to understand that our public communication also has to have all three in a very carefully woven together. And we also need to reinvent our relationships within progressive movements, what I call humanizing movements. Even activists and progressive peoples are both victims and protagonists in this entire complex situation. And we need to expand and rebuild our own transformative movements, for which we require to also understand our own psychology, mutual trust, mutual support, caring in and across our various groups. We cannot become a mirror image of the neo-fascists. In fact, we have to be exactly very, very different from that. Much more celebrating of diversity, allowing for much more diversity of opinion within a broad democratic framework, and also recognizing that people today need solidarity. They need social support. The reason why they are flocking to neo-fascists is because they're seeking some sort of collective security. So we have to say that you are not alone. We're all in this together. Our social processes, our social, cultural, and maybe even political processes have to offer people an alternative sense of collectivity and a sense of coming together and a sense of supporting each other, which will be far, far more powerful than anything that the neo-fascists can offer, because it's based in much more material and much more concrete foundations. So I'll conclude here. This whole topic is huge, and I deleted many of my slides because I was not sure whether we'll have enough time. But I think I've given you a brief flavor, and I'll just conclude by a quote by Bertrand Russell, who said almost a century back that I think, he's talking in the 1920s, I think the subject which will be of most importance politically is mass psychology. Its importance has been enormously increased by the growth of modern methods of propaganda. Although this science will be diligently studied, it will be rigidly confined to the ruling class. The populace will not be allowed to know how its convictions are generated. And I think that is exactly what is going on. Today, mass psychology is brilliantly manipulated by neo-fascist leaders, whereas progressive forces, rational and liberal forces have neglected this area. We really need to understand it, and that is the way forward for us to be able to challenge and overthrow neo-fascist domination wherever it may be and replace it by democracy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. It's really been a fantastic tour de force, I would say. You've really taken us through a lot of things. Before we go to question and answer, and there's been a lot of good activity in the chat, lively discussion, and I'll be reading some of the questions. Before I read those, I just want to mention that you know, the main thrust of the main upshot of your analysis is that we cannot just appeal to reason when trying to stop neo-fascism. And this is exactly the premise on which we started Peace Vigil. You know, we use cultural terms, we use cultural tools, we use street theater, we use stories, we use music in order to appeal to people's emotion, and at the same time try and make it so that it's not incongruent with reason, and that we build our base. And we do it, of course, the people we're talking to are largely people who already kind of are supporters of they're not Modi Bhakts mostly, but they're people who talk to Modi Bhakts and they can use those tools in their own conversation. So what you're highlighting is exactly our methodology as peace activists. So thank you very much for that. With that, may I begin to ask some of the questions that have come up in the chat, sir?
Yeah, sure.
So the first question I'm going to take is from Farid Dosani. Sir, aapko sunai de rahe na?
I can hear it.
Yeah. So Dr. Shukla offers a very good explanation of why people may have followed Trump in the first instance. However, they still seem to follow him even after he's failed spectacularly. Not sure why. The older fascists, Hitler and so on, maintained their leadership through force. This is not true of neo-fascists today. So why people still follow him? Is it only because of cultural values? We can take the questions one at a time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. See, I think one thing is clear that neo-fascists support their leader, not necessarily only because he's in power. Even when he's out of power, he's still representing the same kind of, processes in their minds. And he's, concentrating those processes in a certain way in his own personality. So that search for identity, that imagined sense of injustice, which is being being challenged or countered by the leader, and that imagined collective, which you feel you're part of when you're following that leader. All of these remain even when Trump is out of power. But my hunch is that we between hardcore, the categories A, B, and C, which I talked about, and the categories D and E, and people who are a little closer to the middle ground, there is a spectrum. And people who are in the D and E categories can be won over now. A, B, and C, I'm not sure. I mean, maybe I'm sounding a little, pessimistic, but I think they're a minority. There's a huge majority. So in India, for example, about 35% people voted for BJP, a little less than that. So that means that 65% people did not vote for him. So first of all, we are saying that those other groups, they need to be better, allied with each other. But even in these 35%, there's a significant large chunk which can be won over to a progressive or liberal kind of politics. But that will require somewhat different approaches probably than what we have until now. And I mean, we can discuss that. So even in the case of Trump, I think that, there is a scope for many people to move out of that circle of influence. The bubble has been broken to some extent, at least.
For sure. I'm going to go to the next question. Alina Kale asks, if it's the emotional side that neo-fascism appeals to, is it helpful to do emotional first aid before correcting facts and figures? If someone says Kumbh Mela will save everyone, to identify the needs and emotions that underlie this and engage on the need for safety that the person evidently has, and that only afterwards, once they realize that we're listening to them, correct the facts. If I can sum up what I think Alina is trying to say, do we have to be therapists for the right? Do we have to help them through their emotional trauma before we can actually have a discussion with them? That sounds like a lot of work to me. I don't know.
See, it depends on how we are going to operate. Is it on a one-to-one basis, or is it as some sort of larger collective activity? So if it's on a one-to-one basis, actually that's going to be a tough job. I mean, I would not, I would not recommend that as the first choice. I mean, of course, it's somebody in your family or something. Maybe you may be willing to invest that kind of time and energy. But what I would say is we need to identify non-threatening areas of common ground on which we can have a dialogue with people who are currently under the influence of neo-fascism. One mistake which we make is to react. This person is arguing completely irrationally, let us assume. And we find it so stupid, maybe, that we just dismiss. We say, oh, you're so stupid. I mean, you don't understand this. And that puts a wall. And the dialogue breaks down. We have to be more mature than them. Let me put it like, maybe this sounds a little condescending, but I mean, we have to have a different kind. Are we emotionally secure in ourselves that, we know that our arguments are much more in favor of the interests of ordinary people, in the interests of peace and justice and whatever else. If we are confident about that, we can say, okay, we can agree to disagree on certain things, but let's talk about something which is of common interest to us. What is happening in the corona epidemic, for example? This is what I talk about. And people are seeing what has happened because of privatization of health systems. What is happening today in privatized hospitals, how various policies have, and people reluctantly do agree that, yeah, okay, I mean, some things are not going so well, even if Modi ji is great. So we have to create a common ground for discussion, and we have to create that wedge, I would say, which can enter into that bubble. That is something that has to be done skillfully. If you're not willing to do that, then we cannot have a dialogue. We can only have a dialogue if there is some common ground. I mean, a meaningful dialogue. Otherwise, it becomes like a slanging match, which is not very useful. So yeah, to that extent, we need to understand what is going on. If we just dismiss it, then it's not going to go anywhere.
Yeah, I've been having this fight with anti-vaccine people who have no idea of science and so on. And my initial reaction is just to be very angry and dismissive. And it really doesn't work. So it's something you have to train. It's a muscle you have to exercise, yeah? So question I want to ask from Shine, which I thought was a very good one. So Shine Kapoor, our volunteer, asked, in the current corona situation, she has seen in her friends circle, which is mostly like there's a lot of Bhakts who she knows in her friends and family. She has seen them become anti-Modi like achanak se, like just at once because of the mishandling of the corona situation. How do we explain that?
See, as I said, it's a bubble. It's like a mass suggestion, and sometimes you can be rudely shaken out of that. This is also known to happen. So it depends on how strong a bhakt you had been, or how strongly you had been identifying with that. So something which shakes up, your entire system, your entire belief system, can shake you out of that also. I think this is a very good time in India for us to frontally challenge the neo-fascist hegemony. I mean, it's not a good thing to say that, it's a crisis, but it's also an opportunity. But I mean, sometimes we have to deal with the historical situation.
The next question from Aradhita. Aradhita says that, look, the RSS has a good amount of lower caste support in Bengal. How do RSS appeal to lower caste people? Why do they have such support? Can emotion really overshadow the emotion of being unjustly treated? Or is this the Hindu teaching which itself denies the existence of injustice by forcing karma theory? The basic question is how do we explain the fact that in many places, not just Bengal, I would say Gujarat and many other places as well, especially the muscle of the RSS generally comes from OBCs, what we would call OBC or lower castes.
Yeah. So actually, this is an interesting question, that why do lower caste people get attracted to the Hindutva kind of paradigm? And there's a book which says I Could Not Be a Hindu. And basically it's a follower who was a very staunch follower of the entire, Ram Janmabhoomi movement and so on. And then later on, he realized that even within the movement, within the Hindutva movement, how lower caste people are subtly, constantly discriminated against. And there's this entire large group. We should publicize that book more widely. It's not sufficiently well known. And this group of Hindutva leaders came to his house, to his village in Gujarat, and he cooked a very good meal for them. And they took the meal, they did not eat it there, and they threw it away secretly because he was untouchable. So they could not eat food cooked in his house. And he came to know about this. He saw that food. And then he completely converted. And he said, these guys are just... So there are innumerable instances and examples of how lower caste people are discriminated against within the Hindutva fold. We need to highlight these more. And we need to, also continuously talk about the Manuvadi discourse, which is against Dalits, against women, against people of subordinated castes historically, and how their entire ideology is linked with Manuval. So I think that's something that needs to be done more. It's not been done enough by the progressive movement also.
100%. And if people go to our YouTube channel, they will see some lectures by Professor Shamsul Islam on the Manusmriti and other things. So I think,
Samir, sorry if I may just interject here for a moment. We have found in our peace education work sometimes that because of the hierarchy created by the Hindu society, i.e. the caste system, there's a great desire for the lower rungs to be part of the upper rungs. And when Hindutva appeals to the larger religious sentiment saying, oh, we are all Hindus, the lower rungs actually feel a sense of affiliation. There is an identity that they see in it, and they feel that this is a way to improve my standing in society. So obviously it's a false understanding because they become part of this larger fascist project, thinking that their own situation is being promoted. But as Dr. Shukla pointed out, it is not, because within that fold, like the example that you gave, that the food of this person was thrown away. So I think that falsehood exists, because when you see the identity as Hindu, you feel like, okay, I'm now equal, or I may be able to improve my status, but actually it doesn't happen. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that, Shini. I just wanted to say, Dr. Shukla, you mentioned this book, and would you be able to, in the next week or so, maybe just make a note of some key, this is also a question from Mr. AD or Ms. AD, saying, please, could you suggest some academic articles or books on neo-fascism in India? Can we make a small list and we can share it with this group?
Yeah, I'll try to do that. But I'm not warning, but I'm just telling you that on this area as such, you'll find relatively less information.
100%.
But around it, you'll find a lot of stuff,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Mrigank is saying, thanks for a fantastic talk. Can Dr. Shukla suggest a group in Mumbai or Pune that is working towards the aim of, that is working on these issues, basically?
Are you based in Mumbai or Pune? If so, of course, you're welcome to contact us. Or if you know somebody in Pune who is interested, there are different kinds of groups. So we have a health movement platform, which is, of course, across Maharashtra and actually also in other states. But right now we're talking about Maharashtra, called Jan Arogya Abhiyan. You're welcome to associate with that. And there's a larger social movement platform called Jan Andolan Sangharsha Samiti, which is across Maharashtra, and where various mass organizations and progressive groups have come together. So yeah, we are very much preoccupied with the whole issue of neo-fascism. It's our most important agenda, along with pro-corporate policies. So you're welcome to get in touch with me. And maybe Samir, you can share my email address.
Of course. Of course, I'm happy to do that. Next question is from Samira Mukhtar, who says, given that democratic systems are integral to combating fascism, democracy is often presented as foundational to capitalism. But a cursory review of recent history tells us that the ideals of socialist or communist models of political and social organization did not create capitalist societies. This is a long question, and it has a long answer. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a question here that has to do with critiques of the Soviet Union, which I don't think we necessarily need to get into in this talk. But I mean, I think that there are some Stalinist models, especially, that one could call sort of echoing these sort of strongman kind of things. But this is a great question, but I think it's a little bit beyond the scope of today's.
Yeah, but I'll just say one thing here. It's an important point, but as you say, it's a big topic. But I would just like to say that our understanding of democracy as being mostly limited to political democracy is very limited. So capitalism allows a limited kind of political democracy, but no economic democracy, very little social democracy. So you have a vote, but in society, some people have huge amounts of wealth and some people have absolutely no wealth. In society, some people are white, some are black, some are upper caste, some are Dalit. There's no social democracy, gender, and so many other. So many other kinds of channels of democracy are kind of sidelined or put in a secondary position, and only a limited kind of political democracy. That is also like once in 5 years. After that, once you've elected somebody, in the next 5 years, you just have to relax and or 4 years, whatever. So in contrast, despite all their other shortcomings, which are of course significant, economic democracy and social democracy, right to healthcare, right to education, right to employment, right to housing was much more in some of these previously socialist countries. So we let us say that both of them were flawed in different ways, or both of them had partial democracy but not comprehensive democracy, what we actually require.
100%. And and listen, in my own work in anthropology and political economy, like it's not the case that what we call even capitalist societies are really capitalist, right? Right now we're having a big debate about vaccines. Vaccines are intellectual property is inherently an anti-capitalist concept. So these ideas, and also, if you look at the United States, so much money is spent by the government supporting the military-industrial complex. I mean, it's more than the entire rest of the real economy. So is this really capitalism at all? I mean, there's sort of deep questions to be asked about this. In my view, it's not capitalism, it's socialism for the rich, right? So anyway, but this is sort of getting beyond the current debate. There's a question from Kushagra Hunts, who says, question for Dr. Shukla, a lot of people feel their personal experience in life aligns well with the neo-fascist narrative, and hence it makes sense to them. How can one counter such a support for neo-fascism? I don't know what this means exactly, except maybe to say that some people, in my own experience, because I grew up in the West, and then I spent time, I spent time with my wife's family in Delhi. And what I found was that a lot of people, they just had never met a Muslim. Like a lot of even my cousins or my wife's cousins had never really, like they were asking me funny questions, like whether I apply iftar 5 times a day and stuff. Like it was just very surreal. So the extent of the othering is so much that it just sort of aligns. It's their life. They don't think outside those bounds. So how do we break through that?
Yeah, I think organic interaction across religious and other racial and so-called lines in other platforms is something that we have to actively encourage. And that's why I talked about collective institutions. So when you go to a public hospital, you don't see, I mean, everybody can go there. Or you go to, if your child is in a public school, or in other these kind of public services and entitlements, when you travel even in a local train in Mumbai, I mean, you don't see who is, I mean, everybody's in the same coach. So these kind of spaces, common spaces, have to be strengthened, and we have to find ways of encouraging people to interact beyond their limited circles, because this is a very powerful dynamic, this in-group by binding and out-group hostility. That is exactly what neo-fascists making, which I mentioned. And we need to understand that that can be broken by encouraging interaction between heterogeneous groups. To the extent that heterogeneous groups interact with each other, that can be broken down. That hostility can be broken down, and it can be replaced with solidarity.
So in other words, we need to make friends with people who aren't like us.
Yeah,
as a basic rule. Fantastic. The last question, or at least the last question I see for now, that maybe, feel free to still type, we still have some time. Are there catchwords which demagogues use to trigger a fascist following? If there are, how can we counter that? I think this gets to another point that Alina raised that I didn't mention, which is that the right wing is very good at the cartoon, at the meme, at the catchword. You said "Make America Great Again" is one, but there must be many others. How can we counter that kind of propaganda? Yeah.
Yeah. There are books which have been written about this, and I would recommend you to read those books. Somehow this is not sufficiently, well read even in the progressive circle. I can tell you half a dozen books which have been written by progressive. They're not radicals, but they are progressives of some kind, which have actually said how, for example, in the US context, how Trump could have been defeated through a different kind of posing of the agenda, and which was not done. And so I think there are a number of such insights which are there, how we can puncture or bypass the neo-fascist discourse and connect with people in a powerful way. But one thing is very clear, that just logical, rational arguments are not enough. And just a laundry list of demands is also not enough. We have to have a narrative. People go for narratives. So if we say we stand for 117 things which are all correct, that's not a narrative. It's good, but it's not a narrative.
I think I've written that manifesto many times
and we keep doing it because, of course, we want all those 117 things are important, but there's something great. So when he's saying let's make America great again, then we have to say something. So you see, for example, Jeremy Corbyn has tried to do that. I think even David Sanders tried to do that to some extent, putting together that counter narrative and to say that this is a Britain for everyone. So then it's saying something different and beyond, and then you break it down into all these constituent parts. So we have to have appealing, overarching narratives which will broadly appeal to people. That is different.
Dr. Shukla, one thing that does
and the
help,
second thing is
we find one thing that helps to change the narrative is storytelling. We find that it's a very powerful way to take the same words that the fascists are using, but turn them around and present them as a story. And we find that's a very useful way.
Yeah. So Abhi, there's many memes are going out, but one is called Ab Ki Baar Antim Sanskar on the COVID epidemic.
Fantastic.
So my other point is neo-fascists cannot tolerate humor. And neo-fascist leaders are you never find them laughing in a neutral or healthy way. Huh? So they're either sneering against their opponents or they're shouting. So humor is an excellent, antidote to, they cannot survive ridicule. So it's not just that we oppose them, they're also so silly, we have to expose how silly they are, And I think good quality humor is also very, very useful. You have to just bring them down out.
Fantastic stuff. So the things that are coming up in the chat now, one is a request for the book list again, which again, we will do something. We'll get you guys something. There's a second thing that's coming up in the chat now, which is, so we talked about like now being an opportunity to pry people away from, because of the COVID issue and the crisis and so on. But someone is asking, the next time that there's a Pulwama, the next time that there's a crisis, won't those people who we pry away, won't they just go back to supporting Modi?
We have to vaccinate people, ideologically. As a doctor, if I'm allowed to use that word, we have to tell people in advance that, look, there is a Pulwama is likely to happen. Because we know these guys have very little, that is a big strength of ours actually. They have very few tools at their command, actually. Yeah? Whipping up hatred and insecurity is basically the crux. And then posing as the savior to people in that situation. That's it. I mean, more or less everything that they do can be boiled down to this formula. So their formulae are fixed. They're not very intelligent people, I can tell you. I mean, maybe I sound a little arrogant by saying this, but they're not even very particularly imaginative beyond a certain circle. So we know what their tools are. We should tell people in advance, look, before the election, this guy is going to do something. What are you going to do? Or what are we going to do? We should be prepared for that. So if we vaccinate people against these kind of negative ideas in advance and also have a counter narrative ready, that we are not going to be swayed by, some last minute, nautanki. And as I said, we should ridicule, not just oppose. We should show the hollowness. We should show the, the sort of, the whatever, that's something which doesn't even deserve to be engaged with. It's so superficial. If we 100%. Can do that, then maybe it can be one thing which can help. There's another question about Ambedkar. Ambedkar as a narrative and a symbol. That's a very good comment. And I would say that, definitely I agree with Ambedkar. I mean, the fact that, he represents a very powerful counter symbol. Bhagat Singh is another. I mean, in our own history, it is such a, from Gautam Buddha and Kabir to Bhagat Singh, Ambedkar, and a whole pantheon of progressive and revolutionary activists and leaders of different kind. Actually, in the entire freedom struggle, these guys don't even have a single, leader of any kind who contributed anything. So we should actually bring those forth, and whether it is Jhansi Ki Rani or whether it is, Savitribai Phule, there are a whole range of, progressive historical symbols whom we was much stronger, forefront and say that, what do you have? You have nothing. We have this entire heritage with us.
Fantastic. And I'll just say that of the people you've mentioned, we have a long series on Bhagat Singh, featuring Bhagat Singh's nephew, 3 parts, I believe that is. And we also have coming up in June, we'll be doing something specifically on Rani Lakshmibai in 1857. So look out for that. Also on the previous question, I mean, in my mind, the ultimate vaccination is being part of a different group. Like, you know, so that's what we're there for. We are there to try and create the peace groups, the groups that are supporting peace, the groups that are actively going out and saying, no, you know, don't do this. We are all getting along. The group that is celebrating Diwali and Eid and Christmas and all the rest of it, right? So that's what we're trying to do. Has asked
and just
question.
saying, yes. So Samir, I think what you're saying is that people don't leave groups; they join new groups.
100%.
You know?
100%.
So we have to create counter collectives which are attractive enough. That 100%. Is critical.
You know, there is something before we take Astha's question. I just want to mention that to join a group, I would recommend that we have started a new group called Good Things Happen Too. It's a small Facebook group, but there we discuss ideas that can change things. So, you know, it's actually talking of positive things we can do. And I encourage you all, if you are on Facebook, to please join it. It's called Good Things Happen Too.
Great, thanks. We are moving towards the end of our allocated time, but I just want to take a couple more questions. Asta has asked this question several times, so let me just repeat it. She says, thank you, sir, for a mind-blowing talk. My question is there any positive side of fascism or neo-fascism?
Well, it depends on how we want to define positive. For the followers, obviously, it is something which is positive. Frankly, I feel that in historical terms, both fascism and neo-fascism have offered nothing positive to society. I mean, I'm sorry to say this in case, because it's a complete reversion of the progressive movement of history, and it seeks to, reverse the wheel of history in a certain sense while dividing society in a more or less violent manner, usually more rather than less violent, and fragmenting society in ways which is maybe irreversible or very difficult to reverse. Because if you cause communal riots and hatred to be propagated beyond a certain point, even to bring about the kind of healing can become very difficult. And so just for political gains of a certain kind and to enable corporate forces to reinforce their hegemony, if you are willing to destroy the social fabric in such a violent and completely inhuman manner, I mean, I find it very difficult to see what could be positive in that. But of course, there's an illusion of positivity for the followers, if that is what you're referring to. And they feel empowered. They feel a certain sense of identity and being part of a collective and so on, which I've already described. So that negative positivity has to be replaced by a more positive version of positivity, our vision of a better society in future. Unless we do that, then just criticizing the neo-fascist leader is not going to be enough. But having said that, I don't think there is anything much. I mean, in case you have something in mind, you can mention it, but I don't see anything positive which it offers to society in any country of the world, by and large.
Thanks so much for that. There's a question that's come up around how to create healthy humans right from school, because I feel the schools themselves are producing individuals who turn to fascism. Let me just say, Siddharth, that I'll let Dr. Abhay take this in just a second, but there's also a long interview we have with Anita Rampal, who is an expert educationist and also part of the same group of activists who've been very active on this issue. So she is an expert on education policy in India, and we went into some depth on that. It was right at the time, it was about a year ago because the pandemic was just starting, I remember. So you can go back on our channel and look at that. But Dr. Abhay, anything on education?
I very briefly mentioned it in one of the slides, that disciplinarian schools. So if you read an interview by Richard Levins, he says that my dad, when he sent me to school in New York, he told me, learn everything they tell you, but don't believe all of it. And learn to look at it critically. I think that's a very good piece of advice. So our children obviously will have to go to the existing schools and they will have to more or less learn things which are being taught there. but they should do it with a spirit of skepticism and independent inquiry. If that is kept alive, see what corrodes for neo-fascism, the maximum is independent thinking. And one thing which I found which appeals to people is that do you want to be a copy or do you want to be an original?
I love it.
And yeah, in fact, I had a slide on that. So you see all these people with Modi masks. I don't know if in other countries also they have that, but India, you know.
Oh yeah,
So
they have Trump masks and all. Yeah,
they have Trump masks. So do you want to be a copy or do you want to be original? Most human beings will say, even if they are not, you know, very intellectually capable, and I would like to be an original. I think keeping that spirit of original, independent thinking alive, even among children who go to the existing schools, that has to be done at home and also maybe by groups of parents or communities and so on, community groups. We have to do that. And of course, in course of time, schools themselves need to be reformed. There's no question about that.
Fantastic. And Shirin's also reminded me that we have another educationist, Nadima Jogi, who's a South African educationist who is dealing with specific issues around racial integration and linguistic integration in post-apartheid South Africa. That's also a very fascinating discussion we had with her some time ago. Samira Mukhtar is asking, so she's mentioning two groups in the US, the Proud Boys and the Boogaloos. She says they're neo-fascist groups that use humor and comic stances as a way to grow membership and hide their motives and actions. Ridicule seems to feed the movement. Any suggestions on how to diffuse their hold on people's psyche? I don't know if you're familiar with these particular ones, sir.
I don't know about.
I mean, I am. I'm not 100% sure what she's referring to, but my sense is that, you know, there's a kind of it may not be openly racist humor, but it kind of tends to be in that direction. Que ye log aisa hai, ye log vaisa hai. You know what I mean? So they use a kind of a humor that others, and I think in India this probably exists too, but somehow certain groups find it extremely successful. These are some of the most racist groups you can imagine. So I don't know. What do you think about that? Because I guess she's saying it because maybe it counters your previous point about humor being a way to diffuse the strongman. What do you think?
So, well, I mean, I'm not familiar with those groups in particular, and it's possible that they must be doing something of that kind. But as I said, at least in the Indian context, we have seen that, and probably also in many other contexts, that these neo-fascist leaders themselves are very antithetical to humor. Now, what other groups might be doing is that they feed on a sense of imagined injustice, or imagined sort of, these groups are being pampered too much, with reservations or positive affirmative action or whatever welfare programs and so on. Those are typically the kind of things which are, sort of criticized. So I think that we need to, first of all, our humor has to be very sharp. And, they have much more to lose with humor. If the battle is around humor, we'll be much more successful, I'm pretty sure. Because humor is always a barb against the powerful, almost always. Yeah, and humor which hits at the weak, it usually doesn't strike such a strong chord. It kind of sounds like a little like hitting somebody who's already fallen down. So sarcasm is almost always against the powerful, usually. So I think on the terrain of humor we have a better, a better chance, and our humor has to be more effective, and we have to hit out at the powerful in a much more effective way.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, sir. And thank you to everyone who's put their comments and their questions in the chat. I really think it's been a great discussion. With that, I'd like to turn it back over to Shirin.
Dr. Shukla, thank you so much. It really was a brilliant talk. I couldn't have asked for a better Saturday evening. For me, it is evening. For you, it's night. And for a lot of our listeners today, it's morning or afternoon. I thank you from Peace Vigil. And from me personally, I really learned a lot. So thanks a lot. In the end, all I will say is that peace needs all of us. Please don't think that only the United Nations and the big NGOs and, those powerful people whose Twitter accounts are seen by millions are the only ones who can make a difference. Actually, all of us can make a difference wherever we are, even around our dining table, we can make a difference. If we are a teacher, we can make a difference in our classrooms. If we are a mom, we can make a difference in our children's lives by teaching them the right stuff, which we all do, I know, but we need to put in a little more effort and be more strategic about it. As Dr. Shukla said, it's not just facts, but also emotions that we need to pay attention to. If we have a neighbor who has a sympathetic heart, a good heart, it's important we talk to that neighbor. What we discourage people from doing in Peace Vigil is to go around and fighting with everyone on social media, because we don't even know whether those people really exist, whether they're trolls, whether it's a false identity, we don't know. And they're here today and not here tomorrow. So let us actually concentrate our energies on either people we know or people we know we are going to meet tomorrow, or in groups like Peace Vigil or other social groups. It doesn't have to be Peace Vigil. So in a collective form. So we join others to make a difference. Otherwise, we are just spending our energy, writing a comment here and throwing a, abuse there, or, it's just, we are just everywhere, and it doesn't really solve the problem. So let's be strategic about it. And we at Peace Vigil are there to help you with the tools and with the techniques we have. You're welcome to write to us. And I will make sure that any resources Dr. Shukla sends are sent your way by email. So thank you once again. And please do remember that peace needs all of us. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.